Bobette, Dexter, Braxton.
Bobette, you lived in Gallipolis, Ohio your whole life?
No, I left after graduating from high school and went to Washington, D.C. to work.
Okay.
And then when I retired, I moved back home.
You moved back home? Now, when you were in Gallipolis, did you attend the Lincoln School?
Yes, first and second grade. Started when I was 5 years old, so I was not a kindergartner.
Did they have kindergarten at Lincoln School?
Nope, they had first grade.
First grade. You always began with first grade. Okay. Now, when you went to Lincoln School, was that the end of the Lincoln School era?
Yes, they integrated the schools in 1951. I was in the second grade then. And of course, it was a big boast around here because we did it 2 years before Eisenhower commanded it in 1953.
Okay. Eisenhower was then becoming president, so, but of course, Truman had already begun the process by integrating the armed forces, and of course, you had Jackie Robinson in the breaking the color barrier in baseball.
Well, don't talk about the Redskins, because that won't work.
Well, that won't work with you. Okay, we won't talk about
from Washington, D.C., that man swore there would never be a black football player in Washington, D.C.
Well, I think he's probably missing his opportunity now with the
I know.
with RG3 as the quarterback, right?
Oh, no. Doug Williams, Super Bowl champ.
Doug was a wonderful player, by the way.
Yes, indeed.
Rambling, yes, wonderful player. Now, the aspect of Lincoln School, do you have any memories of Lincoln School, per se, that you can share with us?
I don't have very many because it was first and second grade, so I was 5 and 6. I do remember it wasn't a big deal to go to Lincoln School because our grandmother lived right next to it. So we went there every day anyway, and so all you had to do was continue down the alley to get to Lincoln School. And that's the way I walked to school. I always went past Grandma's first and bugged her. Sometime I made her give me breakfast. And then I walked on to school and went to first grade with Miss Isabel Scott, was the teacher for first and second, all in the same room.
Now, we've heard a lot about Isabel Scott. Did she have a profound impact on you?
No, not a whole lot. I just remembered this. I thought she was too strict on some of the boys in particular. And I knew if she liked you, you liked you. And she didn't, she didn't. So I called her mom, so she loved me all the time.
Okay. You know how to play the game. Did you get a good education, you recall, from Lincoln
first and
School?
second grade?
Yeah. Did you like
Yeah. I
enjoyable?
loved going to Lincoln School. All of our friends were there. When we walked to school as a group. We'd wait on each other, walk to school, get there and stand and wait to go in. And then we went to school. I enjoyed my experience. I enjoyed recess, playing on all the different kinds of equipment. And I loved the merry-go-round because I got sick every time I got on it.
That can happen.
And the only thing I really remember, I remember the first grade quite distinctly and what I was being taught. But because the second grade was in the same room, I don't remember anything about the second grade except I sat at the back door and I was the first one out for recess.
Sometimes that's important now. Sometimes you got to have your priorities in the second grade.
I learned it all in the first grade.
What about transition to Washington? How was that?
Well, for me, it wasn't too difficult. I know for others it was very difficult. We were sent into the third grade with a teacher for me named Mrs. Bryant. You could tell that things were a little uneasy, but she would happen to be a very good teacher. And she kept things low-keyed. She didn't let anything get out of hand. The only thing that I had difficulty with in the third grade was I have really long pigtails, and the boy behind me always wanted to stick them in inkwells.
Yeah.
We had inkwells in the old-fashioned desk. But I didn't have much of a difficulty. In fact, I made better grades when I went to Washington School for some reason. But I think that was because if Miss Scott liked you, she liked you, and if she didn't, she didn't.
Okay, well.
Yeah.
But let's say, did your experience at Washington, were you involved in clubs? Were you involved in any of the activities
In
there?
grade school?
Yeah.
In grade school, the only thing I joined was band.
Okay.
And they started their band in the 5th grade. So I actually played in the band through my entire school year after I became in the band.
Well, the band was as significant in some respects as the football team. You know, it was very prestigious to be in the band. So how were you received, let's say, by the white kids? Was it, you know, would you face any difficulties? Did you have any problems?
Well, if I did, I didn't pay any attention to them.
Okay.
My mother was a person, as you well have met in this interview. We had to mind our own business. You better not stand on the street and take too long to come home. So there was things that we just didn't do. We didn't get involved with very much, and we did not hang around the white students at that time. You came home. I think I heard Althea talking about we came home. And that's exactly what we did.
It was much like the 5 o'clock rule, as the
Yep.
Sort of like the blue vein rule, these kind of like unwritten laws that
Yeah.
became part of, let's say, certain neighborhoods that,
Well, we had a color line here.
right.
You heard somebody mention Spruce Street, and you heard, I think it was out there, said if you lived to the east of Spruce Street, that you were considered in the white community. When you went to the west, which is here in our area, that was the black community. It was like being across the railroad tracks.
Which was part and parcel of a lot of communities, even the cemetery
Yes.
in Gallipolis.
Yes.
You had the colored cemetery and you had the white cemetery. I recall Elaine Armstrong telling me a story about trying to bury a World War II aviator, I think, in the white section, who was quite a hero, as a matter of fact, and certain people having this recalcitrance about this individual being buried in the white cemetery. It seemed that that's
Well,
still...
we had plots in the white ones too, but there was a section for the blacks in the white cemetery. So all the Lee family is buried in the white cemetery.
Right. And it's still a, now it's a sense of, let's say, of historic,
For the Pine Street Colored Cemetery?
Right.
Yes.
Back then it was more or less the way things were.
Well, it was either you were buried in the church cemetery or you had a private cemetery that you would go to. But we've got you back pretty far, like the early 1900s. If that's-
Now, when you went to, you had siblings that went to Lincoln School too?
No, I was the only one.
Only
All the
two-
rest of my sisters started at Washington School.
Okay. So it was like you're the end of the era then, as a matter
Yeah.
of fact. And so...
Yeah, if you had the person attended the first grade, you'd have the last person
The last
that
person.
went to Lincoln School.
Right. And so, like I say, your memories are not that great, but you do have distinct understanding what it was
Oh.
like to be in the classroom, what the teachers were like, and
Oh, yes.
and you received what seems to be a consistent good education given at
Yes.
Lincoln School,
You had a good education, that's for sure.
and it was a quality education.
Yes, it was.
And one thing when I've done these interviews, you don't hear anything about people going on not to be successful. You don't hear of troublemaking. You don't hear, let's say, of somebody, let's say, well, you talk about this student, he get into drugs, get into this. Lincoln School just basically says you went there, you were disciplined, you knew your place, you were well-mannered, and you went on to be a productive citizen
Yeah, you were taught respect. And like what is really happening today, we wouldn't have half of our problems if some parents would instill respect, I think, in their children. Then you wouldn't have things going on today that we have. Because we didn't come up against our mom and dads like we watch on the news. You wouldn't get up if you came up against your mom and dad, because you'd be knocked out on the floor. But they don't do that because now the law says don't discipline your children.
But in many respects, it was the family, church, and school that was the combined social.
Always in the black community.
In the black community. It's very,
Always.
very important. And with the closing of Lincoln now, has that changed the black community in Gallipolis?
I think the employment situation changes Gallipolis a lot.
Okay.
Because I think blacks or whites, if you don't leave, you will not have a very good job because they're few and far between.
Right.
But at Lincoln School, when it closed, the Lincoln School did not close. I don't know if anybody brought that up yet or not. But the playgrounds were segregated. So we never left Lincoln School for years. We went up there for a playground opportunity every summer. And I think Pauline Gordon, I meant to ask Thelma when she was here. I believe she was one of the people in charge. I think
Minnie Washington.
Miss Minnie Washington was in charge, and we went back there every summer, and we had a ball. They had arts and crafts and music, and we had parades. We really enjoyed it. In fact, it's written up many times in the Gallipolis Tribune about the activities at the separate playgrounds. But we must have been at the separate playgrounds for the next 6 years.
How long did that last?
Until probably I was in 7th or 8th grade. I have to look over at my sister. Can you remember, Althea? How long did our playground situation last? The next 6 years after the school closed?
About something like that, yeah.
About the next, until we were ready for high school, I
Yeah.
think we went up there and had a
That's
ball.
probably like, if I'm not mistaken, we interviewed people at the Emancipation. They talked about like 1959, there were certain, let's say, transition full-time to the integration. Was that when they closed Lincoln permanently?
No, they closed Lincoln permanently in 51, but they
Yeah.
kept the
But
playgrounds
as far as the
open.
activities, though, as far like 59, would that be it? So in other words, the
Might.
the parks were open to African Americans after 59. The playgrounds were open.
With the full integration of everything,
Right,
probably in the late 50s.
right.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what year.
So the crafts and stuff at Lincoln School would thereby be closed after this took place
Right.
because you would not have to go, wouldn't be segregated.
Right.
Okay.
And really, we didn't go downtown whether they had a playground or not. You know, we had kept into our own communities, so in the summertime, even if the Lincoln School was closed and not open, we were at the Lincoln School.
Right.
The basketball, played football. I lost both of my knees.
Teeter totters, they had all that.
Yeah, they left all the equipment.
And they
So we were there
maintained
for
it.
years. Yeah, really enjoyed being there in the summer. It was a ball in the summertime.
Well, it sounds like you had some pleasant memories.
I do.
You know, of Lincoln School. This is good to hear. Anything else you'd like to share with us?
Well, I heard you ask Joyce what did she do after she left, or if her education was comparable to kind of getting employment.
How about you?
And mine was, I really did well in school. And when I was in school, the federal government recruited from Gallia Academy because our level of education was that high. But in order to get out of Gallia Academy, if you were a commercial student, that meant you were going to be a secretary, then you had to pass the Ohio's civil service exam, and that was how you graduated, and they actually told you that. So for me, when I was a senior, the FBI came to recruit, and I was selected to go to the FBI in Washington, D.C., and that's where I, sorry, I almost got up to answer the door. I'm so used to jumping. Thanks, Rosie. But I was recruited, and I left 2 months after I graduated. I was in Washington, D.C. I
And you
graduated
stayed
on
there?
June the 6th, and August the 6th, I was in Washington, D.C. working for the FBI.
And you were there for how many years?
I stayed there 7 years, transferred to the Department of Transportation, and stayed there for the next 25, and retired out of DOT in 1993.
And then came back home.
A year later, I came back home a year later. Said I was going to come and take care of my mother, and that's exactly what I've ended up doing.
I'm glad to hear it. We appreciate you bringing her here today, by the way.
Oh, if we'd have left her out, we would have really been missing half of the history.
Well, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, we thank you very much for your interview.
Well, thank you.
Our pleasure.
Yep. Anything else you want to know?
No, I just-
I hadn't heard one person ask you that question.
Did you just pull up stakes in Washington area and move back here, everything? You sold your house and everything?
Well, not really. I moved back. We bought the home across the street from my mother.
Well, I mean in Washington.
And then in
Did you
Washington,
just-
my
did you
husband-
sell everything in Washington?
Now, my husband stayed there for the next 4 years,
Oh.
and each one of my sons and their families moved into the home with their dad, and they saved their money for 1 year, and each of them bought their own homes. The first was our oldest, and then our middle son, and then our youngest son. And then after that happened, he sold the house and moved to Ohio.
That's about segregation at Washington, D.C. when you first went.
Well, I didn't pay much attention to it, but it was definitely segregated. And the only time that I really hit it was when I wanted to go shopping in Virginia. And this was in 1962. And the buses were right outside where I worked. And I walked out there to get on a bus, and the man looked me in my face. He said, "For some reason, I think I need to tell you that when you step on this bus, you're going to have to go to the back of the bus to go to Virginia." And I looked at him because I've always been kind of a sharp tongue if you hit me wrong. And I said, "Is there anything in Virginia that I can't buy in Maryland and D.C.?" And he said, "No." I said, "Then I don't need to get on the bus." So that was my personal experience with it. But my father-in-law thought I should really become acquainted with it. And my mother-in-law was from Richmond, Virginia. And he took me down U.S. Route 1. And that was where colored-only signs, white-only signs, from Washington, D.C. to Richmond, Virginia, that's what I got to look at and had a first-hand experience with that. That was a little rough. But I'm glad I had it because when I went to the Department of Transportation, I worked in civil rights for 25 years. And when I heard you asking about the different acts that impacted, I don't think we got any Black history education at all in our schools. They weren't taught then. They came up much later when civil rights movements in the early 60s got started, but I actually got none. But when I got to the Office of Civil Rights and found out what accomplishments Black Americans had made, my mother said to my face, "Don't come home, Bobette, because I know you're going to go see the history teacher." And I said, "Yes, I am." Because, why didn't you tell us about how marvelous black people were and their accomplishments. But I learned it in Office of Civil Rights, and I stayed there, and I was the complaints administrator for civil rights complaints for race or color, national origin, sex, and the complaints against our agency. That was my job. I made the first ruling on them and then sent them up to our Attorney General, and then we'd have to go to court if that complainant wanted to pursue it. But that's where I learned about the accomplishments of blacks, was working in the Civil Rights Office.
What stuck you most? With all the accomplishments, what hit you most?
Benjamin Banneker.
And
he
why?
is my favorite person. Benjamin Banneker. He
Next
just,
to me, we got to straighten this out in the next one.
Well, I happened to get an assignment to research Benjamin Banneker for a program that we were going to put on. And to my great shock, there was one living man who had written a book on Benjamin Banneker. And I was sent to find him. And when I located him, he said, "Come to my house." Well, for some reason, I took my youngest son with me. He was in the 7th grade then. That was the nicest man, but he was a recluse. So he gave me his books, his slides, his films, walked me through the whole thing, gave it to me, and said, "Okay, go do the presentation." Well, that triggered me. So we went to Baltimore to the archaeological digs for Benjamin Banneker, found out how many patents he owned, because he was really the first person to make a clock. I was utterly fascinated. He was a next-door neighbor for Colonel Ellicott. You've heard of Ellicott City, Maryland?
Mm-hmm.
That was Colonel Ellicott, was his neighbor. And when he died, they burned his house down the night after with everything he had ever patented in that cabin. The only thing that they didn't know was when he got sick, he sent the books that Colonel Ellicott gave him, sent them back to his home, but he stuck all the papers inside of his books that proved he had made all those patents. So they did not get the patents. So I enjoyed that the most of anything that I've ever done. The most terrifying thing I did was at the FBI, we were told, do not go to the March on Washington. And at lunchtime, I just looked at my friend Diane and I said, "This is historic. I'm going. I got a lunch. I'm going to lunch." And we ran over to the mall and walked among the people and just had a blast just so we could say we were there. So that was the scariest thing, because I could have been fired for disobeying that order, because that was J. Edgar Hoover's reign when I went up there.
We promised not to tell him.
Oh, I don't care. He's dead now. He's dead now, so you can't take that away from me. You know, those are the experiences that you really,
They're
really
wonderful
cherish.
experiences. Thank you for sharing them with us.
Yep, well, you're more than welcome.
Anything
Next
else you
time
want
I'll write everything out.
Well,
I got to do a lot, met a lot of people working in civil rights.
Oh, yeah.
I met Dr. King and his daughters,
Mm-hmm.
met Jesse Jackson.
well, Jesse came here a few years ago.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, when he came down for emancipation. He was
Right.
supposed to come down for emancipation, met Mae Jameson, the black astronaut.
Right.
Met her, met Sally Ride, because I was the women's conference, the Hispanic manager, the civil rights manager, the Title VI manager, the Title VIII manager. If you name it, I did it all in that office. Kind of like working at John G.
Well, yeah, real similar, real similar.
Real similar.
Except you don't have the bell there.
Well, that's true. But we were fortunate to have gotten that.
That's a wonderful bell.
Yeah. Mr. Bob Evans had sent that bell down to Grace Methodist, and when we opened, he told Dorothy about it, and he told them send the bell back up here to us.
Well, great.
And that's how we got the Lincoln bell. And Mr. Morris Hogan worked that platform to get it on wheels that move, and you better not try to move it. It is so heavy.
I'd hate to have been the person to put it up there, you know, that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.